In the early 1600s, a big change was starting in Europe. It began in Germany, with a monk named Martin Luther. He didn't agree with some things the Catholic Church was doing. He famously put his 95 Theses on a church door in Wittenberg. His ideas spread really fast, helped by the new invention of the printing press. Suddenly, people all over the continent were reading what he wrote. They started thinking about faith in a new way. This movement, called the Protestant Reformation, wasn't just about religion. It was about who had power, about money, and about the very heart of Europe. It challenged kings and the Pope. It changed how people believed. This big wave of change didn't stop at the German border. It moved over the mountains and plains into France. At first, Luther's ideas found people who were interested. French smart people and church leaders read his writings. They talked about his ideas for change. King Francis I, who loved art and was a rival of the Holy Roman Emperor, was okay with it at first. He saw the Reformation partly as a political tool, a way to annoy his enemies. But this was a fire that couldn't be easily put out. The calls for change felt right to many in France who thought the church had lost its way. The French king was very close to the Catholic Church. The king was even called the most Christian king. His power was seen as given by God, blessed by the Pope. The church was a strong support for the country, a source of peace and power. So the new Protestant ideas weren't just a religious challenge, they were a direct threat to the way things were. They questioned the king's power and the very base of his kingdom. What started as a religious discussion in a faraway land soon became a matter of life and death in the streets of Paris and the fields of Provence. Things were getting ready for a fight that would tear the country apart. Another reformer, John Calvin, would have an even bigger impact in France. Calvin was French himself, a lawyer and religious thinker who had to leave France and go to Geneva. He wrote in French, making his ideas easy for his countrymen to understand. His book, Institutes of the Christian Religion, was a clear, smart, and strong argument for a new kind of faith. It showed how to build a changed church. Calvin's ideas were organized and thought out. They gave French Protestants a way to be strong and confident. This turned a small, scattered group into a determined and tough force, ready to fight for what they believed in. John Calvin's teachings found good ground in France. His followers came to be known as Huguenots. We're not sure where the name came from, but it became a way to show who they were. These weren't just people who disagreed with the Pope. They were building a new way of life based on how they understood the Bible. They believed they could talk directly to God without needing priests in between. They took away statues and fancy decorations from their churches. Their church services were simple, focusing on the sermon and reading from the Bible. This new faith gave many people a deep sense of comfort. The movement grew quietly at first in secret meetings held in homes and barns. It spread through cities and towns, along trade routes and in universities. Business people, craftspeople, and skilled workers were among the first to join. They could read, thought for themselves, and were connected to the bigger world of European business and ideas. For them, the Huguenot faith, with its focus on hard work, rules, and taking care of yourself, felt modern and strong. It was a faith for a new time, one that seemed to fit the changing ways people made money and lived. The movement was getting bigger, becoming something you could really see in French society, but this growth didn't go unnoticed. The Catholic leaders and the French king saw the Huguenots as people who went against the church and rebels. Bad treatment began. Huguenots were arrested, their things were taken, and many were killed. The first French Protestant who died for his beliefs was burned at the stake in Paris in 1523. These acts of violence were supposed to stop the movement. Instead, they often made it stronger. The bravery of those who died inspired others. The bad treatment made the Huguenots feel more like a community. They became more organized, more determined, and more ready to defend their beliefs no matter what it cost. A very important moment happened when some rich and powerful families started to become Protestant. Important families like the Bourbons and the Montmorencys saw Protestantism as a way to show they were independent from the king. For them, it was a mix of true faith and smart political moves. Their change gave the Huguenot movement military leaders, money, and political power. It changed the Huguenots from a scattered group of believers into a powerful group, like a small country within a country. They now had armies, forts, and important spokesmen. The religious disagreement was about to become a military and political fight for control of France. In the middle of the 1600s, France was a country in trouble. After King Henry II died by accident in a jousting competition in 1559, the king's power was very weak, his sons were young and not strong, and the country was ruled by his wife, Catherine de' Medici. As the Queen Mother and temporary ruler, Catherine was a smart and practical politician. Her main goal was to keep the king's power strong and the Valois family in charge for her sons. She found herself stuck between two powerful and ambitious groups, the very Catholic Guise family and the Protestant Bourbon family. The Guise family, led by Duke Francis and the Cardinal of Lorraine, strongly supported the Catholic cause. They saw themselves as the protectors of the true faith and would do anything to stop the Huguenots. They had a lot of money, their own armies, and strong friends, including the King of Spain. The Guises acted like they were protecting the weak French king, but many thought they wanted the throne for themselves. Their influence at court made people suspicious and unwilling to accept differences, pushing the country closer to war. They were a force that would not give in. On the other side were the Huguenots, led by people like Admiral Gaspard de Coligny and the Bourbon princes, Louis de Condé and Antoine de Bourbon, King of Navarre. The Bourbons were royal family members with a real claim to the French throne if the Valois family line ended. Their support for the Protestant cause gave it huge importance and military strength. For these noblemen, the Reformation was also a fight against the king's growing power and the influence of the Guise family. They were fighting for their right to worship, but also for their old noble rights and political power. Catherine de' Medici tried to find a middle path. She feared the power of the Guises as much as she feared the Huguenots rebelling. Sometimes, she made rules that allowed some religious freedom, hoping to find a way to make peace. But these efforts were often ruined by extreme people on both sides. The unstable situation of a weak king created a power gap. The strong religious feelings of the time rushed in to fill it. The fight was no longer just about how someone should pray, it was about who would rule France. The country was like a powder keg, and the smallest spark could make it explode. The fragile peace broke apart in 1562. In a small town called Vassy, the Duke of Guise and his soldiers found a group of Huguenots worshipping in a barn. The soldiers attacked, killing many unarmed men, women, and children. The Massacre of Vassy was the spark that started the French wars of religion. In response, the Huguenot leader Louis de Condé gathered his forces, taking control of cities across France. The country, fell into a terrible civil war. This wasn't just one war, but a series of 8 different fights that would last more than 30 years. The fighting was brutal and very personal. It made neighbors fight neighbors, cities fight the countryside, and families fight families. Both sides did terrible things. Catholic mobs killed Huguenot communities, while Huguenot armies attacked Catholic churches and destroyed religious statues. The wars were full of big battles, long sieges, where an army surrounds a place to take it, and sudden shocking acts of violence. But there were also long times of uneasy peace, where both sides would get ready again, get more weapons, and prepare for the next round of fighting. The conflict went back and forth, but the deep hatred and suspicion never went away. It was a wound that would not heal. Other countries were deeply involved, turning France into a battleground for their own disagreements. Philip II of Spain, the most powerful Catholic king in Europe, sent money and soldiers to support the Guise family and the Catholic League. He wanted to stop a Protestant king from ever taking the French throne. On the other side, Queen Elizabeth I of England helped the Huguenots, hoping to weaken her French and Spanish rivals. German Protestant princes also sent soldiers to fight alongside their French fellow Protestants. The Civil War became an international fight, further ruining the French land and making the suffering last longer. The wars created a cycle of destruction that badly hurt the French economy and society. Fields were not planted, trade was stopped. Whole areas were destroyed by marching armies. The king's power was shattered as local noblemen and military leaders acted almost completely on their own. A whole generation grew up knowing nothing but war. For everyday people, it was a time of fear and uncertainty. They were caught in the middle of armies and different ideas. The dream of a united, peaceful country seemed farther away than ever. France was tearing itself apart, one battle, one killing, one broken agreement at a time. In the summer of 1572, a shaky peace seemed to be taking hold. To make this peace stronger, a marriage was arranged. The Catholic princess Marguerite de Valois, the king's sister, was going to marry the young Protestant prince Henry of Navarre. The important Huguenot nobleman traveled to Paris for the wedding. The city, which was a Catholic stronghold, was full of celebration, but also with deep tension. The people of Paris didn't trust the Huguenots, and the Guise family saw this gathering as a chance to settle old scores. Catherine de' Medici hoped the marriage would finally bring the fighting groups together. The plan went terribly wrong. A few days after the wedding, on August 22nd, someone shot and hurt the Huguenot leader, Admiral de Coligny. The Huguenots were furious, demanding justice. Fearing a Huguenot uprising and losing control of the situation, King Charles IX and his mother Catherine made a terrible decision. Scared and pushed by the Guise group, they allowed a sudden attack against the Huguenot leaders. In the early morning hours of August 24th, St. Bartholomew's Day, church bells rang out across Paris, signaling the start of the killing. The slaughter began with the murder of Coligny, whose body was thrown from his window into the street. Then the violence exploded across the city. Soldiers and Catholic mobs, stirred up by extreme preachers, went on a wild rampage. They hunted down Huguenots in their homes and in the streets, killing them without mercy. The killing wasn't just organized, it was wild and personal. For 3 days, the streets of Paris ran with blood. The violence then spread to a dozen other cities across France, continuing for several weeks. Thousands of Huguenots were murdered in one of the most famous terrible acts of the 1600s. The St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre was a turning point. It greatly reduced the Huguenot leaders and terrified Protestant communities across Europe. The hope of living together peacefully was shattered. The massacre made the deep hatred between Catholics and Protestants even worse, making future agreements almost impossible. For the Huguenots who lived through it, the event made their thinking more extreme. They no longer believed they could trust the king. They started to think about ways to fight back, saying it was right to fight and even remove a king who was a tyrant. The war became more desperate, more about ideas, and more violent than ever before. After the massacre, the wars continued with new anger. The French throne passed from one of Catherine de' Medici's sons to another, but honestly, none could stop the fighting. When the last Valois king, Henry III, was killed in 1589, that family line ended. The rightful person to be king was now the Protestant leader who had barely survived the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, Henry of Navarre. He became King Henry IV. But, being the rightful king and actually ruling France were two very different things. The powerful Catholic League, supported by Spain, refused to accept a Protestant king. They controlled Paris and much of the country. Henry IV was a brilliant military leader and a charming person. He was practical, a man who understood how power really worked. He spent the first years of his rule fighting to win his own kingdom. He won important battles, but he couldn't capture Paris. The city held out against him, suffering through a terrible siege, where an army surrounds a city to take it. Henry realized that winning battles alone wouldn't be enough. Most of his people were Catholic. They would never fully accept a Protestant king. He understood that being united was more important than his personal faith. He was a king first, and a Protestant second. Faced with this situation, Henry made a very important decision. In 1593, he famously said that Paris is worth a mass. He officially gave up his Protestant faith and became Catholic. This was a stunningly smart political move. It was an act of extreme practicality meant to heal his broken country. For Henry, the survival and unity of France were the main goals. His change removed the biggest problem for him to be accepted by the Catholic majority. The gates of Paris were open to him. The Catholic League started to fall apart, and one by one, the rebellious noblemen and cities gave in to their new Catholic king. Henry's change was met with doubt by some and celebrated as a miracle by others. Many Huguenots felt betrayed. They had fought for him for decades, and now he had left their faith. But Henry didn't forget them. He knew that to have lasting peace, he had to protect the rights of the Protestant minority. His change was the necessary price for the country to come together. It was the key that opened the kingdom, ending decades of civil war. He could now focus on rebuilding his shattered country instead of fighting his own people. The long, dark time of war was finally coming to an end. With the wars finally over, Henry IV turned to the problem of different religions living together. In 1598, he issued the Edict of Nantes. This wasn't a statement of complete religious freedom in the way we think of it today. It was a practical, political agreement. The edict said Catholicism was the official religion but gave the Huguenots specific limited rights. They were allowed to worship in certain chosen towns and on the lands of Protestant noblemen. They were given full citizen rights, including the right to hold public jobs. Very importantly, they were allowed to keep their own fortified towns to guarantee their safety. The Edict of Nantes was a very important document. It was one of the first times a European country had officially recognized that two religions could exist within its borders. It brought an end to the civil wars, and allowed France to begin the long process of getting better. For almost 100 years it provided a way for a tense but workable peace. The Huguenots remained a distinct and often mistrusted minority, but they were protected by law. The edict was a testament to Henry IV's idea of a strong, united France where religious differences didn't have to lead to endless bloodshed. However, the peace it created was fragile. To many French Catholics, the edict was an unacceptable compromise with what they saw as wrong beliefs. For the French king, the Huguenots' fortified towns and political meetings were a challenge to the king's absolute power. Over the next few decades, the rights of the Huguenots were slowly taken away. Then, in 1685, Henry IV's grandson, King Louis XIV, completely took away the Edict of Nantes. The Sun King believed in one king, one law, one faith. Protestantism was made illegal. Churches were destroyed, and hundreds of thousands of Huguenots were forced to change their religion or leave the country. The story of the French Reformation is complicated and has lasting effects. The bad treatment and eventual forcing out of the Huguenots was a huge loss for France. The country lost many of its most skilled craftspeople, businesspeople, and smart thinkers. Yet the long struggle had deep effects on what it meant to be French. The wars made the central government stronger, as people looked to a strong king to prevent another civil war. The discussions about unfair rule and fighting back during the wars planted seeds that would later grow during the Enlightenment and the French Revolution. The story of the Huguenots remains a powerful reminder of the fight for acceptance and the terrible cost of extreme religious passion.